Welcome, Thomas Sargent. It's a great pleasure having you here. Tom, this is, I think, now your third week in India, and it's probably too early to ask what impressions you're going to take away. But I'd love to hear a little bit about some of the things that you heard at the Neemrana conference. I want to talk a little bit about your own discussion and your panel presentation at the conference. But your first impressions of India and the economic policy making process and how that might be going.
Okay, so the first thing is, my first impressions of India were formed way before I came to India. This is my first trip to India. So my first impressions of India are from friends who happen to be economists who were born in India and educated in India and then came to the United States. So it turns out there's some great, I'm a macroeconomist, so great macroeconomists who come from India. One was, he passed away, is Rao Ayagari. He's a student in Minnesota, did path-breaking work. He's a good friend. Another is V.V. Chari, who's at the University of Minnesota. Another is Ravi Jagannathan, who wrote a tremendous paper with my co-author, Lars Hansen, a revolutionary paper. And one of my new favorite ones is Anmal Bhandaria. He's a student, a former student. He's now at the University of Minnesota. And I've learned a lot from him, writing papers for him. So they've all told me a lot about India. So one is they're kind of reflections of India because they receive their basic education here, their college educations here. They receive the beginning of their graduate educations here. So my impression of India is, when I came here, there's some very smart people who are very well educated, well spoken. They'll speak English much better than I do.
It's the one thing the British left behind.
Yeah,
apart from
we don't speak English in the United States. We speak some kind of slang American. So I'm conscious of that. So that set the stage, and then at the Neemrana conference, I'm privileged to be very quickly around some very obviously also some well-educated people. So it's a very biased view. All India can't be like that. So there's some very good economists and very good policymakers. So the discussion was very good. Those are my impressions.
Tom, you spoke very eloquently, and of course, the history of economic thought has been a great favorite of yours, and you not only revolutionized the field of macro, but also made very insightful contributions to the history of monetary policy in the United States. You spoke about two things that really fascinated me in terms of new work that you are thinking of. It'd be great if you could say a few words about the two things. Heterogeneous beliefs, I believe, in the way you are expanding your thinking about how that might affect rational decision making in the economy and the role of policy. And then I think there was also going back to Keynes and his book, of course, on Indian currency and finance. And I actually happened to bring both copies from the NCER library. So that was the book that Tom started out his panel discussion with. And then, of course, you've always considered yourself as a Keynesian, even though many have tried to call you a non-Keynesian. So it'd be great to hear about some of these things from you.
So I guess I'll work backwards and start from the Indian currency book. So the reason I mentioned that book at the Neemrana conference, there were a couple reasons. First, this book, Indian Currency and Finance, I have a copy of this. I went to some effort to get a copy. I've read it several times. So this is one of...
it's not very easy to read.
Well, I think it is. So it's easy. So here's what this book about. This is a book about... I think it's one of Keynes' first jobs. He came to India, served in some capacity as an advisor to the British government. And in those days, Britain was concerned about the Indian currency system. And so India for a very long time had been on a silver standard. They used silver, more or less full-bodied coins, and they, I think involuntarily, they became part of the. It's not a very nice story. They became part of the British Empire. Britain was on the gold standard, and there were people in Britain that wanted to move India
to a gold standard.
more completely into a gold standard. And
Yes.
Keynes came in. So Keynes was a person who respected past literature. He was very influenced by Ricardo and Marshall, who wrote about monetary economics. He was a young man in those days, if 30 years old.
This was 1913, so I think this was when he was...
He wasn't even 30. He wrote this before he was
30.
30. He was born, so he was a young man.
Yeah.
But he had read monetary history. He knew what institutions were in Europe. And when he came to India, he very quickly admired the existing institutions in India, and basically said India had evolved into a system in which it's true that there were silver coins circulating, but domestically, but it was as if they were tokens that were convertible. They were already convertible into English pounds because of the activities of Indian bankers.
Right.
And he said it was a very good system, and it should be that it evolved into. So he said it was already good practice. So what fascinates me about this is here's Keynes talking about something that he wants to. So it's a tension between what's optimal, that you're thinking brand new and devising better institutions, versus trying to understand institutions that evolved. And that's actually it's actually a long theme, not only in Keynes's work, but it's in a lot of work in macroeconomics and microeconomics. And then the final thing is, I think I can see that this book casts long shadows on Keynes's recommendations for the IMF and the World Bank and the Bretton Woods monetary system. So I think his time here had a lot of influence.
Yeah.
That makes it even more exciting for me to be in India, actually.
Well, it certainly caught the attention of all the participants from India at Neemrana when you opened with his reference to his book on Indian currency and finance. We also talked at Neemrana, Tom, about, and we had the privilege of having Raghuram Rajan, the governor of the Reserve Bank of India. And as we have been seeing and as we discussed, he's certainly pushing hard on forward guidance in terms of the kind of signaling that he is trying to give on inflation expectations. How does your sense of how forward guidance in India, given that inflation expectations are perhaps not as robustly anchored here as they might be, say, in some Western countries? For example, the Reserve Bank of India doesn't even publicly announce its inflation and growth forecasts, much like the Fed does. Do you feel that this will have as much traction here? Will Raghu's forward guidance or his market signals perhaps be interpreted as well as they might be elsewhere?
Yes or no. Since you mentioned Keynes, maybe he's on my mind. But as you're speaking, my mind goes back to a statement Keynes made in the early 20s. And what he said is a rich country can have a very bad monetary policy and a very weak currency, and a very poor country can have a very strong currency. And Governor Rajan knows that.
Of course.
And what there was something else said at the conference that I'd like to quote. I'd never heard it before. It was a quote attributed to Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England.
Yes.
And I assume the person who quoted him accurately. What he said was, he said, it's not true that central banks are obsessed with inflation, like you say Rajan now is. What they're obsessed with is fiscal policy.
Right.
It's a very clever quote.
Yes.
And then I was thinking about that for the next hour. So if you look at this book and Keynes's book and the way we do macro nowadays, the reason central bankers are obsessed with fiscal policy, and this is what Keynes meant in his quote,
Yes.
Is that you can't run a good monetary policy. You can't run a stable, low inflation monetary policy unless you get support from the fiscal authorities. You basically have to have a close to balanced budget, not every year, but in a present value sense. And you know, there's the monetary and fiscal policy authorities. They're nominally independent, but when you write down the government budget constraint, you consolidate those two.
Sure.
They're consolidated. In one way or another, they have to coordinate.
Yes.
So lots of times there's a struggle for who's dominant.
Right.
Because monetary policy over and over again has been, inflation is the handmaiden of the fiscal authorities, generate a lot of revenues by printing money.
Yes.
And when you say you're going to limit inflation, you're going to say you're not going to do that. The fiscal authorities have to do something. So that's the struggle that's in the background. And so my answer to your question is, and it's a force of Keynes quote, it'll work in India, it'll work anywhere. And you know, even at the conference, I heard him say things that indicated his intention to make it work by adopting procedures that have been successful in stamping out inflation in other countries. There was some tension at the conference about whether he was going to do that in the right way, and I really enjoyed that
because it so represents the tension in the profession as well.
Yeah, well, it's an important issue for the country.
Yeah, well, certainly I think he is holding fast to his beliefs that his actions and his reticence in lowering rates, for example, is correct, even though there is obviously immense pressure from the fiscal authorities in some sense and the public and industry for that kind of a rate reduction.
So you know how my friend Neil Wallace and I used to talk about this?
Yes.
So in some instances, more often than I can find it in U.S. history, I can find lots of, the monetary and fiscal authorities sometimes play a game of chicken. You know what that game is. So one of them, each of them says that they're going to do something,
right,
which isn't feasible unless the other one stops doing what they're doing.
Right.
So if the monetary authority says, I'm going to behave in a way where I don't buy government debt, the government's going to have to sell the debt someplace else.
Sure.
And it's probably going to have to actually start issuing less debt. Something like that's in the background.
I think so. And you made the point at Nimrana that the Federal Reserve today has huge fiscal power simply because it's the owner of all these assets that it has acquired.
Well, okay, so this has happened, and this has been part of a, not quite in the press discussion, but right under the radar discussion that during the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve Board acquired new powers. And essentially it acquired, so the term is, it acquired the power to pay interest on reserves.
Right.
Okay, so there's another way, if you just, actually you've this Keynesian logic in this book, in Attractive Monetary Reform. You study what that means. What it means is the Federal Reserve has acquired the power to issue interest-bearing debt. It didn't have that power before. That's a fiscal power.
Exactly.
And it means it has the power to commit the government of the United States to future taxes. That's a big change.
Yeah.
And we're going to hear more and more about that.
Yeah.
It's sort of all governments have to decide on the line between monetary and fiscal policy. We discussed that in a little at the conference.
Yeah, we did. And I think it's a very live issue here because there isn't the kind of institutionalized independence that exists in the US here in India. But nonetheless, I think Dr. Rajan is chalking out a path for the performance of the central bank that perhaps hasn't been chalked out as carefully. I don't think we've had as professional and as research-oriented and as erudite an academic and a researcher and a scholar in the central bank for a long time.
I think few countries have ever had a governor of a central bank with the qualifications that he has.
Yeah, no, we are incredibly lucky to have him, and lucky that he spent the entire 2 days with us at the conference. But when you think about optimal monetary policy, something, of course, that you worked on, in a developing country like India, where the monetary transmission mechanism is a lot weaker, and it's not anchored again, as well as perhaps expectations are not as anchored as well as they might be in developed countries with stronger institutions. Should we be thinking about rational expectations differently?
So I was actually discussing this with some very smart graduate students in the last couple of days in India. So what rational expectations means, it's actually a technical term that nerdy economists use to describe properties of their model. So the philosophy is that the people inside your model can forecast at least as well as you can. Now, do I believe that the common people I've met in India are as well informed about prices and are as interested about them as I am? Yeah. I think it's the right assumption anywhere. And inflation, when inflation starts getting high, people pay more and more attention to it. And
of course,
they know what's going on in terms of their lives. So I think it's a great assumption. I'd use it to analyze U.S. data when most people hadn't finished grammar school.
Talk about a bit about the work you're thinking of doing on heterogeneous beliefs, I think with Lars.
Well, first thing is, in macroeconomics and microeconomics, rational expectations is very widely used. It's used everywhere in the world. And it has a kind of communism associated with it, that everybody, there's a kind of a unity in the way they form beliefs in there. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a really good modeling assumption. It has proved very fruitful. But my friend Lars and I are working. Actually, you can find precedents in Keynes' early work. The idea is what happens if you actually, the people inside models, actually they have a model, like they have some implicit model of the world, but they don't completely trust it. And so they actually carry along a set of models, and they try to figure out it's like doing scenarios, and they look at sets of scenarios, and then they make planning, and they're interested in making decisions that are pretty good under no matter what scenario. So that there's something called robust control theory that Lars and I are using. Well, it actually naturally leads to a kind of ex post, it looks like heterogeneity because in beliefs, because what's a worst case scenario for you is different than what's a worst case scenario for me, because we have different views. We have different, maybe we have the same set of models, but we have different purposes. We have different interests.
And preferences.
Yeah, we might have different, in effect, preferences, and we might have different situations. We could have different situations. You could be mainly a lender, and I could be mostly a borrower. This is actually a classic example, one of the first examples of this kind of work. So I've dyslexic. You're a lender, and I'm a borrower. So what's kind of the worst case scenario for you is if interest rates are really low.
Yes.
Worst case scenario for me is if they're really high. So there's kind of so if I'm kind of guarding myself, there's a kind of gap.
Right.
And actually this can lead to bid-ask spreads. It can do things to affect how much trade occurs.
Right.
And it can fluctuate. So Lars and I kind of use this as, so the idea is, Keynes and Knight call this not risk, but uncertainty. Uncertainty about the model. So Lars and I built models where, what you think you might call risk premia, they're moving radically. And they're not moving radically because just the well-understood risk is changing. It's because the model uncertainty is changing as certain situations evolve. So that's what we're doing. Whether or not it's a problem with heterogeneous police for an economist is you have much more to keep track of.
Right.
Because if I have to keep track of beliefs if I just say what's the expected rate of inflation, and you know, we saw some survey numbers at Nimarana, and those were the presumption there was everybody was basically
using
making
the same
forecast.
Cost. Exactly.
So you can present to the head of a bank or a fiscal authority, this is what the expected rate of inflation is, the public is. Now if I have to come to you and give you 10 disparate forecasts.
Whole distribution of them.
Yeah, and it's going to be a lot messier. But there's some exciting work that's using heterogeneous beliefs now. About, an example is Harrison and Krebs and Jose Schenkman have models where there's people who are optimists or pessimists. And they alternate on whether they're optimistic and pessimistic.
Oh, so they switch.
They switch. Okay, so you take a model like that. They have a great insight. Harrison Krebs. You take a model like that, and you have incomplete markets. You don't let people insure everything, and you have short sales constraints. You don't let them short sale. And what they found is that prices of an asset can be higher than you think the fundamental value, or that I think the fundamental value is. We both think we think that the value asset is higher in price than either one of us would be willing to pay based on our assessment of the fundamental value, meaning our expected
So that's a
value
bubble?
of the dividends. That's a bubble.
Right.
Okay, so that's a bubble.
Right.
And here's the reason for the bubble. I buy it when I'm an optimist, not just because I think partly of the fundamental value, but partly because I realize in the future I have the option to sell it to someone who's even more optimistic than I am.
Right.
The other person does the same, and it puts this
Starts
bubbly
building up.
component. It builds up, and this can be bad. Jose Schenkman has examples where it's bad because the asset price goes up, and just like Tobin's Q, resources get allocated to that.
Of course.
So stuff gets built.
Right.
It shouldn't get built. Like those houses they built in the desert in Arizona.
Right.
So then Jose has a recommendation about this. What kind of financial regulation do you do to stop bubbles? Here's what Jose finds. Allow short sales. Allow
right.
short sales.
Which is so counterintuitive.
At first it's counterintuitive, but then you think about it in this model. What short sale does, it empowers the pessimists to artificially increase the supplies, give the optimists what they want.
Right.
And when you work this out, it lowers the amount of the bubble and it can kill it. So this is an important thing. This is on the other hand, if you allow leverage,
Yes.
it fuels the bubble.
Right.
So I'm sure Raja knows about this model. And I hope the people in the Fed know about it, because whether bubbles are there, whether they're good or bad, that's become an important issue for monetary authorities. I've heard some monetary authorities in the United States behind closed doors say bubbles are good.
Why?
So here's the logic.
They force new ways of thinking about regulation?
Not that sophisticated. That's a great idea. That's not what they say. So here's what they say. They have models where there's imperfect. These are Bernanke-Gertler models. So these have the stamp of a very authoritative person, and they're coherent models. What they have is impediments to our borrowing and lending, and because of imperfections, I have to put up collateral. And the amount that you lend me is going to depend, and it's good for you to lend me because I have a good project. You won't lend me unless I have collateral. The value of my collateral is higher if there's a bubble.
Oh, so you can leverage.
It's leverage, and you loosen up some. Some money flows my way, and in some of their models, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So if the Fed is, I don't know how much they don't say some of this in public. The Fed wants asset prices and housing prices to go up for this reason, and so I find this is really interesting stuff. What's also interesting is the issues in the United States and in India or England. They're more and more common.
Yes. Yeah. And Raghu's coming actually has brought this whole tension between inflation targeting and what the fiscal authorities want much more in the open than it has ever been in this country. And I think the debate here is now much closer to some of the concerns in the US as well.
That's what I thought I've heard at the conference.
Yeah.
The conference was wonderful for an outsider because it's I'm more than ignorant about, more ignorant than ignorant about India. So I'm coming in with, except for my prior that there's a lot of smart Indian economists. I don't know a lot of the facts, and I learned a lot at the conference.
I'm so glad. Will you come back?
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
Well, it's been great talking to you, Tom, and thank you so much for joining us. And we do hope we can invite you back to Neemrana. And certainly, if and when you do want to do some work on India, we'd be delighted to offer whatever help at the National Council that we can. It's great having you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.